Penanda, diolch yn fawr iawn fi Ingwahoth. I think I'll start with the issue which is uppermost in a lot of people's minds at the moment, which is the issue of second homes, particularly in Wales. And we've seen how in many parts of Wales, particularly the coastal and scenic areas, the explosion in second homes has pretty well driven local people out of the market. There's just no means to buy or rent for most local people because the price has just gone through the ceiling as people not from the local area have bought up homes either to rent out as holiday lets or just for their own personal use, or generally, it now turns out, a mixture of both for reasons that I'll describe in a moment. And it's really a dire situation. I mean, catastrophic for local households who just can't get a foothold in their own community. But of course, for the whole community itself, in some cases, we're looking at community death. And it happens that many of these places are strongholds of Welsh language and culture. And so this has huge societal as well as individual impacts. And nationwide now in the UK, we see that there are roughly twice as many second homes as there are homeless households. This is really a grotesque, a truly disgusting situation. And you would expect that any reasonable government to make great efforts to correct that situation and to ensure that homes are for those who need them, rather than allowing greed to displace need. But the opposite has happened. While in Wales, uniquely, local authorities are allowed to charge double the council tax rate on second homes. Homeowners are allowed to, the second homeowner is allowed to switch to being business rate payers if they rent out their homes for holiday lets for a certain amount of time, and then apply for the 100% business rate discount, small business rate discount, so they end up paying no tax at all. On top of that, since the pandemic began, a second homeowner could apply for £63,000 in government grants. It's basically the richest people get the most money. It's really outrageous. But what this illustrates is a much wider problem to do with both taxation and to do with planning. Now, the reason that houses are so expensive is not because bricks and mortar are so expensive. It's because the land underneath them is so expensive. And that land has risen in price by over 500% since 1995. And it's done so not because of all the people who are underhoused and desperate for housing. They're not the drivers of effective demand. It's the people with the money who are the drivers of effective demand. And what's really extraordinary about this whole situation is that during the whole period in which more and more people have become underhoused or indeed homeless, we've seen the number of bedrooms per person nationwide rising. We've seen more accommodation per head across the whole country, but that's very poorly distributed. And it's poorly distributed because basically the land market has become a speculative market, and it responds to those who've got money to burn. And the second home crisis is just a tip of the iceberg. Just as homelessness is the tip of the iceberg of underhousing, second homes are the tip of the iceberg of the totally irrational way in which we use land in this country. And what we try to do with the Land for the Many report is to propose what we think is a rational, progressive set of policy proposals. After the billionaire press got hold of it, we had to double check the report to make sure we weren't actually calling for the slaughter of the firstborn and the herding of all owner-occupiers into prison camps. We thought they were actually quite sensible proposals, but you can see what a nerve it touches amongst the very rich in this country, that even if you discuss changing land policy a tiny bit, they go berserk. So to give you just a few examples, because we have very little time, what we're calling for is replacing council tax with a progressive property taxation, which the owners, not the tenants, pay. And that would be raised significantly for second homes and for vacant homes. And by significantly, I think it needs to be a lot more than 100%. I mean, maybe we should be looking at 500, 1000%. to seriously deter this scourge from causing community death around the country. But then, to have basically a fair system nationwide. And then if we look at second homes again, there should be planning permission for change of use. If you have changed that house from being a residential place to being a second home, you should get planning permission for that change of use. And in planning in general, what we want to see is far more control by local authorities, with a community participation agency to ensure that local people have much more engagement in that process, even jury service for planning to ensure that there's a much wider spread across the socioeconomic spectrum of people who are involved in that. But the setting up of public development corporations, which will assemble land and then bring in ideally local builders to build homes on that land, rather than just leaving it to this speculative land market, and altogether creating a situation where it's much more likely that the right houses are built for those who need them. And obviously, I think we all agree that what we desperately need is more social homes and affordable homes. And by affordable homes, I mean affordable homes, not affordable homes. But we need those to be geared to the actual need in the actual community, rather than just handed down nationally and imposed on local authorities, so that local authorities can determine their own need and then can actually, through public development corporations, through their own land assembly, go out and meet that need. These are just a tiny handful. I would urge you very strongly, please read our report, because I actually think it's got some great stuff in it. Beth and I are just 2 of 7 authors. I'm the least qualified of them all, but there's some really brilliant people that we've involved in the making of this report. And I think if our recommendations were applied, things would really change for the better. I'll hand over to Beth for the rest of it.
So George has focused on some of the demand side issues, in particular the role of second homeowners in driving up prices. So I'm going to focus to begin with on some of the supply side issues. Let me just share my screen so that you can. I just have a few prompts. Is that sharing? I hope so. So that's great. Let's just focus in. So I often try and divide the problems up into demand side issues and supply side issues. There are, of course, things that don't fall quite into those categories, but it can kind of help people to get their head around what's going on. On the supply side, there are kind of 3 key problems that I want to highlight. First is this dysfunctional land market that we have. We basically leave it to private developers to identify land for development and approach landowners. And it's a very aggressively competitive market. So you have developers competing with one another to bid for the land. And the way they decide how much to bid is that they'll, first of all, start with the figure for how much they think they can fetch on the open market for homes once they're built. They'll subtract then the cost of the build. They'll subtract the cost of contributing to affordable housing and infrastructure. And that will give them a figure for how whatever they have left is what they have available to bid for the land. Now, you can already see from that system that it's the developers that are most willing to compromise on the build quality, who are most confident about wriggling out of their obligations to contribute to infrastructure and affordable housing, who are most bullish about what's going to happen in the housing market. It's those people who will win the bid. It's a system that drives land prices up and drives quality down. And it allows these massive increases in land value that come from the granting of planning permission, which could be used to fund infrastructure and other public goods, to be largely captured by landowners who've done nothing to earn it. Second key problem is that the disempowerment of local authorities. So we've had decades of funding cuts in combination with a refusal to allow local authorities to set their own planning fees and council tax rates and levels of borrowing. And in most cases, unsurprisingly, therefore, local authorities have withdrawn from the active role of placemaking, and they've been reduced to approving or rejecting planning permissions of private developers and then begging for concessions. But even that reduced role is really hard to perform effectively, because, as George mentioned, they've got these targets handed down from above based on national demand rather than local need. They're overwhelmingly reliant on developer contributions to meet those targets, but they just lack the resources and powers to drive a hard bargain. And the result then is that very often local authorities are forced to bypass the wishes of local communities and accept developments, buildings, tenures, amenities that barely resemble what communities really need. And if they do manage to extract some contributions to affordable housing, that will often come at the cost of getting contributions to the infrastructure that's required to serve new developments. And if that wasn't bad enough, then we also have the problem of permitted development rights, which mean that certain types of development don't need full normal planning permissions at all, giving local authorities even less power to maintain standards and collect these contributions from developers. And we've got this asymmetric power as well, but baked into the planning system, so that developers can resubmit their planning applications. They can submit appeals, which objectors don't possess that right, and it just can grind down local resistance to developments. The third key problem I want to highlight is the pressure, the structural pressure on developers to monopolize local land markets and drip feed supply. Because if they or their competitors release too many homes onto the market at once in a local area, that will lower prices in that area. Now, obviously not all developers are evil, but they operate in this dysfunctional system and they have a duty to their shareholders. So naturally, they're shaping the built environment in ways that maximize shareholder value. And it's just not working for us. So to address these problems, we propose a number of things. I'm just going to run a few key proposals. As George mentioned, we propose these new democratically accountable development corporations with the power to purchase that land, develop it and sell it in the public interest. They wouldn't replace private developers altogether, but they'd act as prime movers. And once the land's assembled, they'd contract out construction to house builders, so that the developers are competing on the basis of quality and the design of the buildings, rather than competing on the basis of their ability to navigate this sort of speculative land market. We also propose reform to the Land Compensation Act. This is really important because this is what can enable the state to retain more of the land value uplift that comes from new development. It's a method that's used to great effect in other countries. So, for example, in Hong Kong, the Mass Transit Railway Corporation at the moment buys land at existing value, builds the rail infrastructure, and then leases the land around to businesses at prices that reflect the new value with the presence of the railway. And it enables them to deliver low ticket prices, by world standards. And instead of requiring a subsidy to do that, they actually contribute significantly to the public purse. Now, under the current legal framework, public authorities in the UK are prevented from buying land at existing use value because of lobbying by landowners, which resulted in the Land Compensation Act of 1961. That means that where public authorities want to purchase land for development, they have to compensate landowners not on the basis of what the land is worth at the time, but on the basis of what it might one day be worth if it acquires residential planning permission. And those changes basically ended the ability of public authorities to deliver cheap land for new housing. So reinstating that ability to acquire land at near use value for public authorities could really transform things and unlock really significant funds for infrastructure and other public goods. We have lots of proposals in there for how to empower local authorities and re-energize community participation in planning decisions. I won't go into them. I urge you to have a look at our report. But I did just want to mention that the government's planning reforms for England go precisely in the opposite direction of what we propose. They're built on the false premise that planning is the cause of the housing crisis, that somehow if private developers were free without constraint to just respond to price signals, to demand in the market in pursuit of their own profits, we'd somehow get the quality housing we need and that prices would come down. And the problem with that premise is it ignores, well, two problems. It ignores the fact that the planning system is already very permissive. Around 90% of applications for planning permission are approved in England, and consent has already been granted for 1 million homes that remain unbuilt. So the failure to build the types of housing that we need is not the result of excessive state regulation, but of the dysfunctional land market and development model that I've outlined already. The second issue is that private developers responding to demand is not going to help us to meet need. And because demand and need are not the same thing, and this is so important. It sort of amazes me that I'm still talking about this. I've been talking about it since 2012. Housing need is a measure of how many people need somewhere to live. If prices in the market were determined by simply that ratio between the number of people who need somewhere to live and the number of houses that we have, prices would have been falling between the mid-90s and the top of the boom before the financial crisis. The opposite was happening. Okay, it's similarly in the early 2000s, these enormous housing construction booms that happened in places like Ireland, Spain, the US, they did nothing to prevent house prices surging. So the data makes it very, very clear that dramatic house price inflation in our housing market can't be explained simply by shortages of supply, which is precisely what George was talking about earlier. And that's because housing demand is not shaped simply by the number of people who need somewhere to live, but also by the number of buy-to-let landlords, second homeowners, money launderers using property in the UK to launder money. It's determined by the strength of preference. How desperate are people to escape the rented sector, private rented sector, and enter home ownership, and by the purchasing power available to them, right? Because a desire to buy a property doesn't become effective demand unless you have the money to back it up. The people in the most need in the market exert the least demand in the market. And each of these things have been inflated by very identifiable policy failures. So, for example, we had this massive deregulation of the mortgage market, which I can talk about in the questions if that's helpful. But it led to a flood of cheap, easy credit for mortgages. Now, that may be in the interest of any individual buyer, but if everybody is standing on tiptoes, then nobody gets a better view. It just increases the money swishing around the housing market. The strength of preference, the desperation to escape the private rented sector has obviously increased because of the dismantling of tenants' rights. And the profitability of landlordism, similarly, this is the result of the deregulation, the dismantling of rent controls, the dismantling of security of tenure for private renters in the UK. Of course, that's going to encourage a frenzy of buy-to-let investment. If you look over the last 5 years, on average, every year, there's £9 billion pumped into the housing market by buy-to-let landlords. Of new mortgage lending, that's about 21% of all new mortgage lending is going to buy-to-let landlords. And I can't stress enough how problematic this is. This is a zero-sum game. So every time a landlord buys a house, they are denying another household, another family, the dream of ever owning their own home. So yes, demand has outstripped supply, and that has resulted in a doubling of the house price to income ratio. But don't be fooled into thinking that the solution to that problem is to dismantle what little democratic control we have over the built environment in some kind of desperate attempt to meet this wildly inflated, debt-fueled, speculation-fueled demand. We need to be reining in these volatile, these destructive and exploitative forms of demand, and we should be reorientating our entire development model to meet need and not demand. So I'll stop there so that we have a bit of time for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Beth, and a very passionate finish up there around dismantling the current model that we have. In fact, lots of what you have both said talk of quite radical reform. You mentioned, George, that your report hadn't gone down particularly well in the press. What's been the sort of reception within government? So I'm thinking perhaps if you could comment first on the English government and whether you think maybe there would be a greater and warmer reception in Wales given its has a very different set of priorities in respect of housing, particularly affordable social housing.
Hasn't gone down very well in the press has got to be the understatement of the year. It really is just it's farcical. I mean, you could write a proper farce about it. It's so ridiculous, the hysteria about any attempt to address these issues rationally. Now, with the current UK government, Westminster government, I mean, there's just not a hope. I mean, really, as Beth says, they're heading in 180 degrees the wrong direction, because they are the government of the speculators. They're the government of the financiers. They get massive donations, the Tory party, from property developers. So inevitably they're going to give them what they want, as opposed to those in the greatest housing need, who are very unlikely to be voting for them. So we're really going to get nowhere there. Now, I have higher hopes of the Welsh government, which in many ways is a lot more progressive. And let's hope for a really strong statement tomorrow, particularly following the Second Homes review. But I think what we've so far seen from Cardiff are measures which go a little way and address some of the superficial issues, but don't really cut to the heart of it, and don't really recognise that what we're talking about fundamentally is a land speculation crisis, a residential land speculation crisis. People, we talk about a housing crisis, but that's sort of short-term for what's really going on. And until, whether it's Cardiff, Westminster, Holyrood, Stormont, get to grips with what literally lies beneath that, which is the issue of land and the speculative uses of land and the finance being poured into land, then they're not going to solve the problem.
Beth, did you want to comment as well?
No, go on to the next question, I think.
Okay.
George answered that great.
Just staying a little bit with the Second Homes issue, Welsh Government announced yesterday their three-pronged approach to try and go some way to addressing the Second Homes issue. Do you think that went far enough, or would you be asking for something far more radical?
Beth, would you like that?
You answer it, George, because you had a...
Sure. I mean, look, there's definitely a lot of good in that, and it's really great to see a government even recognising it, tackling it at all, because there's absolutely none of that going on in Westminster. I mean, there really is zero, and Wales has been ahead on this issue. We're now currently seeing, for instance, councillors in Cornwall saying this is insane. We desperately want to raise council tax on second homes, and we're not even allowed to do that. So look, it definitely is good work, but it does need to go a lot further. There's still loopholes which need to be closed. We need to see really swinging rates of tax on second homes, but that has to be part of the wider system, which is this switch to progressive property taxation. Because, I mean, let's face it, council tax is almost as regressive and unfair as the poll tax was now. It's been set in stone since 1991. You've got this ridiculous banding system which ensures that your multi-billionaire with some vast property in Kensington is paying no more than an average householder in Blackburn. It's really an insane system. So what we need is fundamental and structural reform, not piecemeal reform.
Can I just add something on the tax as well? Another proposal that we had in the report was to increase the tax on capital gains for those who are holding homes as investments. And I think this is really important to stress that under our current tax system, you pay more in tax for going out to work to earn your money than you pay in tax for totally unearned windfall gains in the increase of investment properties. And I want to stress, we didn't propose an increase in capital gains tax for people who for homes that people live in, even though the billionaire press entirely lied about that, made it out that is what we had proposed. It's not what we proposed, but nevertheless, that could bring in a huge amount of money, and it would discourage people from using homes entirely in the hope that they're going to rise in value. So that's just something to add on the tax.
No, a good point. Something that came up a little bit with Chloe's report and something that has been discussed at Welsh Government is a land value tax of something. Would you like to comment more on that? I appreciate that does get a mention in your report. Beth?
I mean, in a way, what we propose is similar to a land value tax in the sense that it's a tax that is proportional to the value of the property. And given that on average 72% of the value of the property is the land underneath the property, then yes, what we're proposing is a tax on the value of the land. But I wouldn't go as far as to think that land is the only kind of wealth we ought to be taxing. No, this physical structure is a form of wealth as well. So there's no reason to only tax the land underneath it. A pure land value tax is much more appropriate for commercial land, which is what we suggest. And actually, lots of think tanks are behind that now.
Okay, we've had another question in there around the underuse of property, and commenting that in the last census, albeit that that's a little out of date, that many homes are under occupied. There are more bedrooms than the existing occupation, and progressively you look across mainly owner occupied sector, there is a much greater use of under occupation. Is there something you've had some thoughts when you look through your report, which I appreciate focused on land, but just around the underuse generally of property?
I just start. I mean, Beth will have more intelligent things to say, but I just say that the tax structure as it stands encourages underuse, because there's so little differential between bottom rates of council tax and top rates of council tax that there's really no incentive at all to occupy a house which actually fits the size of your family, rather than one with an east wing and a west wing and loads of extra bedrooms. And given that we have this vast housing supply, but this horrendous maldistribution of that housing, I think the tax system should be geared to directly and deliberately addressing that.
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
One of the comments you put up in your slides, Beth, was around the role of local authorities relative to central government. And we are fortunate in Wales that we have a slightly different sort of power ratio, where local authorities do have a greater level of influence over the planning system and the numbers that they are asked to build in their area. At the same time, the power balance between them and developers is very unequal and uneven. And I know there has been a tension in Wales around radical changes, perhaps of the level that you suggest, will mean that developers will no longer build in Wales, and we will have even less new supply. And you may remember it wasn't that long ago that chief executive of one of the largest national house builders said, because of some of the changes that Welsh Government were looking to bring in, that they would stop building in Wales. And I think that fear still perpetuates. Do you have any thoughts on that, of the sort of radical nature sometimes can have other impacts, if you like?
Well, I think we need to ask what we want our development system to be for. We have an amazing opportunity right now to improve public space from the point of view of health and mental well-being and sustainability and equality. And we are tragically wasting that opportunity because we are so reliant on private developers in pursuit of profits to determine what gets built. And of course, they're going to shape the built environment in ways that maximize their shareholder value, and not in ways necessarily that deliver what we need. So that's kind of why we really want to see public bodies and local authorities taking a lead in identifying the land that's most suitable, in identifying the amenities that are needed, and identifying which tenures, which size of properties are needed, and then contract out to and also to the small. In the past, we had many more small and medium-sized builders, and they went bust because the state withdrew from house building. It used to be the case that you had booms and busts in the housing market, but because the state played such an active role and it was employing these small and medium-sized builders, that they stayed in business. Now we have this incredibly consolidated market. So I just I'm just not sure that the solution is to kind of be desperate to entice developers in, rather than take control of our own built environment. I'm sure George will have more to say.
Well, I'd very strongly endorse that. I mean, it's actually, when you look at the net impact of our system, which is highly reliant on private developers, it's almost entirely negative. The land hoarding, the drip feeding, the speculative price frenzy. What have they brought us? What good have they done us? Have they delivered the social housing we need? Have they delivered the genuinely affordable housing we need? Have they delivered really the housing any particular local area needs to meet its people? No, they haven't. They plainly haven't. This is a dysfunctional system. It's a failing system. And rather than saying, let's create better incentives for private developers and give them even more tax breaks and even more political benefits, let's create a development system that works for the people, not against the people. And that should be publicly led. It should be led by public development corporations, led by local authorities, to meet local demands where and as they occur, rather than either the demands of speculative private development or demands handed down from on high by a remote government which couldn't give a tinker's cuss about local needs.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I find it rather perverse that we have a situation that developers have an absolute perverse incentive to manage supply according to them rather than to meeting need, which is why I think the last numbers, 68% of all the homes built in Wales were 3-bedroom or larger, which is not really what all communities need at all. So there is a perversity about that. One of the things that Shelter Cymru, as it's our conference, have put forward as sort of a commission to look at this in a more radical way, that would bring organisations like Shelter Cymru, Shelter England and Scotland, Crisis, and others. Would that sort of collaboration be something that you would welcome, and perhaps for the whole of the UK, but certainly for Wales as things stand at the moment?
We desperately need it. I mean, there's been a real fragmentation, I think, between the issues of social justice and land justice, between the economic issues and the social issues, between the political issues and the economic issues. We've all been, to an extent, in our silos, looking at the end result of a dysfunctional system and applying sometimes end of pipe solutions to that dysfunctional system, where we really have to understand why it's dysfunctional in the first place. And of course, that was our mortal sin with Land for the Many, that we tried to understand why it was dysfunctional in the first place, because it's literally a genuinely radical position. You're getting to the roots of the problem, and that is absolutely where they don't want you to go. And you could just see how threatened power felt by the fact that we were saying, let's not just have these knee-jerk reflexes to this particular planning application or this particular shortage of homes here. Let's see why the system isn't working. And of course, we have to get together, all of us, to see why it's not working and try to apply the sort of scale of solutions that match the scale of the problem.
Absolutely. Any final words from you, Beth?
I'm not sure. Final words. I would say, it's just essential that we don't fall for the idea. Yes, of course, demand has exceeded supply, but let's look at what's driving demand. Let's look at whether we want to satisfy the debt fueled and speculation fueled demand that's in the market, or actually recognize that if we go out and build in a desperate attempt to satisfy that demand, actually all that new houses is just going to disappear into this black hole of demand and not do anything to address the real housing need. So that would be sort of my top line message.
I think that's a really important message for us all to take away, that it's very easy to see if we build more homes that will be the solution. And your slide was very useful at showing that they get sucked up in other demand in other areas without actually addressing the fundamental problem we're all trying to solve, which is that people can afford a decent home over their heads, and for them to live in. thank you very much, both of you. We could carry on for a very long time, and there's more questions coming in that we haven't been able to get to. So I'm going to have to bring it to a close as we move to our next session. So I'd just like to thank both of you again. Thank you.
Croeso. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch.
Right.